Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today to go with you further now about our French Revolution topic. And now we're getting on to the onset of the revolution. We're building into 1789 and the day, of course, when the revolution actually occurs. If you haven't already, do make sure you check out my previous videos on the series. We've gone through a whole host of information about the French Revolution by now. Do remember as well, these videos are towards the student level, so I'm going to have some key context and sources provided throughout. With that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. And we're going to look at three key things now that occur in this year. First, the Estates Generals, the formation of the National Assembly, and the Tennis Court Oath. So with that said, let's get ourselves straight into it. First off, I have a primary source here for you to consider, just an image. Now, we've done quite a bit of French history now, and so I want to give you a moment first just to look at this. Feel free to pause the video and just think, what is this image showing to us? Can you figure out who all the figures represent, who each role is, what exactly is being presented to us here? Have a quick pause of the video and have a go yourself, or feel free to carry on and listen as I give the answers. There we are, good. So you should have had a go yourself. And so what we have here is a picture, a clear cartoon image that is depicting the burden that is placed on the third estate. The gentleman here who is literally carrying on his back the weight of the second and first estates. So the third estate, we should remember, is the peasantry. It's the poorest class in society. Despite making up millions and millions of French people, it is economically the poorest and it's politically the weakest in the country. But the other estates place themselves over it, the first estate and the second estate, and we should remember that they represent the nobility and religious sectors in society, the bishops and so forth. And so, because of that, they're of course burning the third estate here. And again, it's the peasant class. Again, it's literally a group of people in society who are overworked, they have no real pay, and they have no real rights as citizens. Remember, they don't own any land. They're working over 16 hours a day. They're paying a vast amount of tax and feudal dues towards these other two estates, especially the nobility. And so they're really lacking in wealth and really lacking in power. So we have to understand that as we go further into the revolution now. A big key reason why this is happening is because the structure of the ancien regime is so unfair. It's vastly unequal, creating the conditions over not just a few years, but again, this is decades long this is happening. And so this resentment that is created amongst the third estate can't really be forgotten or overlooked. And so we reach 1789, and France is falling into absolute crisis. Remember, we've encountered a whole host of problems now. Again, we've got bankruptcy that's now occurred by the late 1780s. We've had war that's been happening with things like the War of Succession, the 7 Years' War, and the American War of Independence. And the old fashioned taxation system simply is not providing what is necessary to finance France. Louis's ministers, Turgot and Cologne, had recommended changing the taxation system. Remember, they wanted that universal land tax to include the nobility as well. And by doing that, they would enable the monarchy to tap into a huge amount of untaxed wealth held by the nobles in their enormous estates. This was the greatest hope for the government. If they could get into that wealth, they get into that locked money that they just can't touch right now, then maybe that could help them solve the crisis and move forward. And so, one way they wanted to do that was to create the Assembly of Notables. Remember, this was a group of people who were the nobles and the clergy from the first and second estate. However, by February 1787, that had ended in failure. Second and first estates don't want to have to pay taxes and lose wealth that they already possess themselves. So the king then decides he has to enforce the changes himself. So he uses one of his powers. Remember, Louis has the divine right of kings going all the way back to Louis XIV, the Sun King. And so he tries to use one of those, the lit de justice, to force the Paris Parliament to register the new laws, especially that key land tax and Vingtième. However, the nobles in the parliaments across France refused to register this new tax and actually dared to say the king's actions were illegal. The Paris Parliament refused this because they believed that such a total change in the taxation system required the consent of the Estates Generals. Remember, the Estates Generals were a representative assembly that were brought together among all three estates. They hadn't been called for decades now. They hadn't been called in over 150 years. However, he has very little power himself, and maybe he should allow his hand to be forced and summon those Estates Generals. However, he did not want to do that, as doing so would present him as a very, very weak leader. Again, the French royal government have been able to rule without the Estates Generals for nearly 200 years now. To summon it now would show the ancien regime must indeed be in massive crisis. And of course, we have to remember summoning the third estate is quite a dangerous thing to do. Again, they've been rioting over food prices since 1775. The bad harvest has only made the attitude worse towards Louis and the nobility. And even more, the situation in Paris has really become quite volatile. The Estates Generals were going to allow these people to voice their anger and their dissent. And again, there was a lot of paranoia, a lot of anxiety that maybe the third estate would take advantage of that chance and really call out Louis as this despotic king and therefore try and have him removed. However, Louis believed the Enlightenment, those philosophes, had been influencing them with the ideas of social contract and trying to weaken a monarch's power. The nobility, therefore, may have been genuinely unwilling to make such a change without the consent of all the people. So Louis decided that he was going to take some more decisive action. He decided he was going to exile Parliament, but this was not going to work so easily. So by June 1788, Louis was now facing massive calls that he indeed was a tyrant and a despot. So Louis clamped down on the parliaments, ordering their power reduced and then ordering them to close. However, some refused to close, and Louis decided to use his troops to send them in and force them to do so. As expected, this was met with massive resistance by citizens who were fighting back, becoming quite violent themselves. In fact, there was one such day on June 7th, known as the Day of the Tiles, where some of the civilians were on the rooftops and were literally kicking tiles off the roof in an attempt to try and prevent the army from attacking them. Although no one died, this situation was clearly dangerous and clearly showed how weak everything had become. The nobility were even in open dispute now with the king, and this was officially called the revolt of the aristocracy. Louis had to resort to trying to impose his own authority by using force and direct orders. Again, he'd lost the cooperation of these parliaments. Parliaments were the whole reason he was able to control France. Without them, he therefore was lacking any influence as king. Things are also made worse with the financial meltdown that has been occurring, and by August 1788, it is certainly no better than where it was when we last left them off. With no solution to the crisis, therefore faced a problem with his current controller general of finance, Archbishop Brienne, who had no idea how to solve the mess they had found themselves in. More able men, such as Cologne, Necker, and Turgot, as we saw, had tried, but they had failed as well. Louis needed something else, so he decided to try and win back support of the parliament. He recalled the Paris parliament to the city, allowing it to reopen. On the 16th of August, he decided that France would no longer pay debts and wages. The nation was truly bankrupt. With seething anger among all sections of society, Louis decided to sack Brienne and recalled the only man he had that had any sort of sense of confidence among the public, and that was Jacques Necker. And what was Jacques Necker's solution? It was to do absolutely nothing, except he privately decided to raise a few more vital loans as well, until the Estates Generals could be brought to meet. This indeed was proof now that Louis had no choice. The economy was in ruin, crisis was occurring, the parliaments were resisting him, the aristocracy was in chaos. He had to now call the Estates Generals at last. Such was the only way he could ensure that any sort of taxation change could be brought about to make the nobility finally pay and also to finally relieve that burden that has been weighing down quite literally, not just metaphorically, literally on the third estate for decades now. And so now we reach May 1789. The king had made his decision and was now summoning back the Estates Generals, and there was much work to be done. Again, this was a group of deputies who had not met together since 1614. So no one really knew how the hell this should even work. The events of May to June in 1789 are therefore complicated and chaotic to follow. One of the first events that happened was the creation of a Cahiers d'Adolescence. What this basically was the king had announced that because the Estates General was summoned, towns and regions could now submit complaints and proposals to them that they wished to be discussed and debated in Paris's parliament. Louis hoped that these Estates Generals would be at the meeting at which the finances of France would be discussed, allowing him to finally raise the new taxes that he needed. However, these cahiers that were sent showed that people were concerned with a lot more than just taxation. It was just one of many things that was bothering them, and again had been bothering them for decades. One of the key things that came out was all the Cahiers, not just the ones in the third estate, but among the second and first as well, demanded a new constitution. They wanted a change to the king's royalty and his divine right of power. They also wanted to be able to have the right to vote, to pass laws, to own land, and even those among the second estate were supporting some change in government because they believed it inefficient and indeed practicing a sense of injustice. Again, things like the lit to justice and the Lettre de Cachet again showed that maybe Louis could be seen as corrupt and could be seen as too powerful, having the divine right of kings. Yeah. The most influential of these pamphlets was the one written by Abe Sears. He was a Catholic priest, and he was also a very prolific writer, and he wrote a very influential pamphlet titled What is the Third Estate? So at this point, I want you now to pause the video and just have a read of this yourself. Take some time and really try and understand what is it that Sears is getting at here. Maybe make some notes yourself and attach it to what you've already got. Again, what's his key argument? What's he asking Louis and the ministers to do? And particularly, what does he believe is a big problem in French society? Once you've had a go yourself, unpause the video and I'll share with you my thoughts on this as well. Okay, welcome back. Let's go through it now. I'll show you with the ideas that I've found. Again, you may have found some more yourself, but if you've not got some of my ideas, feel free to add them to your own notes as well. So first off, it's very clear that CS here is talking heavily about the third estate. And again, the third estate, as we said, represents that massive, vast majority of society. Again, over 27 million people are within the third estate. It's near enough all the entire population. And so it's very appropriate that when he says, what is the third estate? He says everything, because they are literally all the people in the nation. He then also says, though, that they have nothing. They have nothing in terms of political order in France. And that's very important because, as we know, they have no power, they have no financial control, they have no land of their own, and they have no political influence. They can't even vote. So they, despite being the vast majority of France's population, they have nothing to show for it. And it's quite appropriate he uses a metaphor here that the third estate is literally a man who is strong and robust, but still has one arm in chains. He knows that because they're so big, because they make up the true workforce of France's society, they are the reason the economy can grow. They are the reason France has won its wars in the past. It used to own parts of Canada, for instance, before losing to Britain in the Seven Years' War. Again, France became as great as it did because of the people that are in it. But yet, here it is now, strong and robust, but still kept in chains both politically and economically. And so says something quite radical a little later on. He actually asks for the privileged order, which of course is the second and first estate, to be taken away. And seeing that actually they're not the backbone of French society, the aristocracy, the arts, all of this, the Versailles itself, the king, that's not what France is. As it says that the nation would not be less but more. For him, the third estate represents everything, and therefore to oppress the people, oppress France as a nation. To remove that then is then to allow everything to be flourishing and free, to literally free the French people and free them from the burden of the economy and literally of the shackles that bind them. And in doing that, he believes France can be vastly improved and therefore maybe find a way out of this crisis, both economically, politically, and militarily, and has found itself in these many decades on. So there's a very clear impact that comes from these Cahiers. We have to remember Sears here, while he's the one we focused on, he is one of thousands who are writing like this and are saying these things and calling for the third estate to have more power. And so we have, of course, the representatives of the estate finally come and meet because maybe, indeed, with all this being brought forward, some change in France can finally be brought about. So the representatives of the First Estate meet. They send their bishops, their parish priests. They send over 300 deputies to take part in this. The Second Estate also sends about 280 deputies as well, with many of them being part of the nobility and especially aristocratic families that date back for generations, right back to the early 1300s. However, there's still a section of them, about 90 or so, who are quite liberal and want to support some change. And they're indeed going to be the ones who are going to take a big part in assisting the Third Estate. The third estate itself sends 610 deputies. However, it's important to note here that although it sounds like a lot, again, there's two big flaws in the third estate structure right here. It's mainly the educated who are within this, the lawyers and the merchants, the traders. It's not the peasants, it's not the craftsmen, it's not even the sans culottes, those urban workers. And the truth for why this is the case is because they just don't have the money. They don't have the education or the means to be able to travel to Versailles and be part of the Estates Generals. And so bear that in mind. What is happening in Paris right now, while the third estate may represent over 27 million people, it is only a small section of the third estate which is actually present there to take part. And so these groups meet and the Estates General forms in the 5th of May 1789 at Versailles, and the king now had an opportunity to try and show some control. He failed to do so. The third estate deputies, lacking experience and not having any sort of obvious leaders, may have been lured in by talks about equality in taxation that Necker was trying to propose. However, there was no initiative being taken here. Nothing was said about a constitution, and the Cahir's ideas were seemingly being neglected. It also was very clear the vote system was very imbalanced. The first and second estates obviously had a lot of wealth and a lot of power, and therefore didn't want to lose any of that power. And so they would combine together to vote against the third estate. Again, despite the third estate literally having over 600 members, its vote was as a collective, so it was only equivalent to one vote. So the first and second estates quite simply just kept vetoing the votes throughout the proceedings. This carried on throughout May and into early June, and no progress was being made. And again, Louis, instead of trying to step in, instead of trying to establish some sort of authority, he just did not intervene and just prayed it would sort itself out. But again, when times are difficult and your nation's in crisis, you need a leader to step forward. And Louis, he's just simply not doing that here. And so, by June 17th, the Third Estate had had enough. And this leads us to the formation of the National Assembly. The patience of the Third Estate had ran dry, and so on June 17th they took action. The deputies voted amongst themselves, and 491 of the 600 or so who were present voted to break away and call themselves the National Assembly. They believed that because, of course, they were the Third Estate, they represented the majority of the nation, the millions, the 27 million people who were there, and therefore had the right to manage its own affairs and decide on taxation itself. In effect, this was a bit of a political revolution. They were doing their own thing. They were not following what Louis and Parliament were wanting them to do. This only escalated further when Louis held a royal session, which he wanted all three estates to attend. However, on June 20th, when this session was being held, the deputies of the Third Estate found the hall at which they had been met had been closed to prepare for this session. The deputies misunderstood this. They thought Louis had literally shut them out and was not letting them take part. And so they moved away to a nearby tennis court and took an oath there, promising not to disperse until France had a new constitution. Unlike before, when the National Assembly was called, only 491 of the deputies took part. Now all but one were taking part. And so he went ahead on June 23rd with the rest of the session. He declared null and void all decisions taken by the Third Estate, and declared himself willing to accept restrictions on his own power, including the right to impose taxes. He believed freedom of press should be introduced, and his power should be arbitrarily imprison or detain people without trial should be abolished. He also wanted internal customs barriers to be abolished as well. That initially would seem quite good. However, given what had happened now with the tennis court oath being formed, the National Assembly now being officially created, people were not going to accept that. And so they refused. The Third Estate refused to accept the King's compromise and stood by their oath. 151 of the clergy were joining as well. The next day, 47 noblemen were also joining the National Assembly. Even a royal prince dared to join as well. And there were popular demonstrations in Paris in support of this new assembly. Louis had officially lost control. And so on June 27, he gave way and ordered the nobles and clergy to join the Third Estate and vote by head. One person, one vote, just as the Third Estate had wanted. The National Assembly was now a legitimate democratic body, and work could begin on creating a new constitution for France. And so let's bring it all together now. Let's all consider now what exactly have we learned in looking at the Third Estate's actions here, and of course, the ineptitude of Louis once again. It is very clear that Cahiers has revealed that all three estates had some problem with Louis's rule, whether that was his powers, the lack of a constitution, or even just his despotic demeanour in using his divine right of kings. Despite the creation of things like the National Assembly revealing there is support for the Third Estate, and indeed the resulting impact of that uniting members across all three, We have to remember the urban workers are neglected here. Again, it's only the educated who are representing the third estate in Parliament. Louis very clearly does lack leadership, he lacks conviction, and he just simply cannot get the estates to agree on anything. All of this progress is only happening because he is losing power and influence himself. He's not taking any ideas from Britain to become a constitutional monarchy yet. He's just literally allowing these estates to take power from him. And he may indeed come to regret that. And the final thing to consider here is that there is indeed genuine progress. One head, one vote was not an official policy before, but indeed had become one in how they'd all acted and combined together. And despite the formation of the National Assembly, the grievances in France are still not over. So, what will happen? How will things resolve? Be sure to check that out in my following video where we'll go over that in great detail. As always, thank you, of course, for listening and taking part in this lesson. I hope you found it useful. Hope you found it insightful. Make sure, as always, to let me know what you thought down below in the comments. What's the most interesting thing you learned? How do you think this is all going to resolve? And again, also check out some further reading in the description box below. That's where I also keep some wider reading that I've been using to, of course, put these lessons together for you. With all that said, this has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.